Now we come to some New Testament references to this first oracle. Even though there are a variety of ways that people have interpreted these oracles, there at least are some connections with the New Testament that we want to be sure that we don't miss. The one that is probably most easily recognizable is the passage that talks about the new king that is coming in riding on a donkey, the symbol of peace. Both Matthew and John in their Gospels link Jesus' entry into Jerusalem with this passage in Zechariah chapter 9. Jesus is the new king who comes in peace to Jerusalem. Then, the betrayal of Jesus by Judas Iscariot also figures in this, because in John's Gospel, first of all, Jesus himself claims to be the Good Shepherd. And in claiming to be the Good Shepherd, his listeners would hardly have missed the fact that this would be connected to the idea of the Good Shepherd in the book of Zechariah, which they had heard about and had read about and listened to many times in the synagogue. So Matthew then links the insulting wages of the Good Shepherd who's rejected and given the wages of a slave, he links that to the 30 pieces of silver that Judas received from the high priest when he betrayed Jesus to his death. And so that's a very prominent link that you find in Matthew's gospel. In fact, later, Matthew is going to describe Judas' blood money, which he threw on the floor at the feet of the high priest. This blood money was used to purchase the potter's field, which is very similar to the language that you find in the book of Zechariah. There are a few possible New Testament allusions to this first oracle of Zechariah. These are not the same as quotations, but they may be references to these ideas. One might be the Good Shepherd's rejection of the flock might reflect upon Christ's rejection by his own. I mentioned that earlier in the passage in the first chapter of John, where Jesus came to his own and his own did not receive him. Another possibility is the new king's reign of peace. He's coming peacefully to Jerusalem, and that certainly is very similar to the language you find of the coming of Jesus. When he is born, the comment is made, peace on earth, goodwill toward men on whom his favor rests. These are the languages of peace, and that goes back to the book of Zechariah. The ruler from Judah, who is the cornerstone that's mentioned in Zechariah 10, might actually reflect upon the language of Christ as the cornerstone, which we find in the Gospels as well as later in the New Testament. Christ is the cornerstone upon which the edifice of the church of God is built. The wars against the nations might reflect upon the visions of John in the book of Revelation, where the nations oppose the people of God. And the regathering and the restoration of the diaspora may actually reflect upon the gospel to the nations. In fact, the idea of the scattering of the Jews, the diaspora, is mentioned in several places in the New Testament. One where Jesus says, I have sheep that are not of this sheepfold, and I must go to them also, which is a way of talking about his mission to the nations. And then in the beginning of the letter of James and the beginning of the letter of 1 Peter, there is the same language of the exiled children of God, or the diaspora, which in this case actually is going to refer to Christians who are scattered throughout the ancient world. The conversion of the Philistines may hint at the gospel to the Gentiles. If the Philistines symbolize those people who are most religiously, at least, in opposition to the Jews, but now they are going to be cleansed and become part of the remnant of the people of God, that in a sense anticipates the whole range of nations who are now going to come to Christ through the gospel. The false shepherd might hint at the eschatological Antichrist, the man of sin at the end of the world. So that brings us to the end of this first oracle, and we are ready to begin the second oracle, which is the last 3 chapters of Zechariah. Many of the same themes continue in this second oracle, the themes of war, the themes of victory, the theme of restoration. And it, like the previous one, is going to begin with this Hebrew word masah, which is the word for burden, the burden of the word of the Lord. Now, formerly, when we were in the oracle that began in chapter 9, we began in poetry and ended in prose. This last oracle is going to be almost entirely in prose. It has one very short poetic section, but the rest of it is in prose. And the central focus of this last oracle is the city of Jerusalem. Well, the war scene is international. In two very striking metaphors, the Lord describes Jerusalem as being under siege. In fact, Jerusalem is described by the metaphor of an intoxicating cup of wine. This is a long-standing metaphor among the prophets in which the wrath of God is often described as a cup of wine in which the nations drink of this cup and are inebriated with the wrath of God. Here, Jerusalem is an intoxicating cup of wine, and the nations that try to drink it will be driven mad in drunkenness. Jerusalem is also described as an immovable rock, a rock that no one can dislodge, and anyone who tries to dislodge it will be cut in the process. And so finally, under the watchful eye of God, Judah's leaders will be like a consuming fire to their enemies. The Lord will fight on the side of his people. And even the very weakest will be as strong as David, who was the great warrior of Israel. And the house of David will be like, they will be so powerful, they will be like the heavenly angel, the Malach Yahweh, the angel of the Lord. In the context of this war, in the aftermath of the war, there's going to be a description of compassion and mourning for some figure who is pierced. Now, there's some textual variations in the Hebrew text here, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, that leave the identity of this pierced one a little unclear. First of all, in the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, and in particularly one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's going to say, "They will look on me whom they have pierced." Now, if we read it in this way, that means they're going to look upon Yahweh whom they have pierced. And this reading is followed in a number of English versions: the New International Version, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, the New English Bible, even the older King James Version of the Bible. But then there is another reading from other Hebrew manuscripts that read, "They will look on him who they have pierced." And if the reading is to be him, then the identity of the him is a little more ambiguous. This is the reading that's followed in the Revised Standard Version, the New American Bible, the Jerusalem Bible, and so forth. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it reads even differently. It says, "They will turn towards me because they have insulted me." And so it doesn't actually use the language of piercing. Well, the different English versions are going to read this differently based upon the text that underlie this. And so whatever the textual resolution, John certainly understands, in the New Testament at least, that this passage refers to Christ. Because when Christ is pierced on the cross, the Gospel of John directly links this to the pierced passage in the book of Zechariah. There's also a very unusual idea that came up a number of years ago based on the reconstruction of a Dead Sea Scroll text called 4Q285. This is back in the early 1990s when a couple of scholars published a work that they believed referred to a pierced Messiah. The problem, of course, is that in those ancient texts, which are fragmentary and unpointed, there's a lot of ambiguity about how to read that actual text. In this particular case, the text could be read either that the enemy will put the Messiah to death by piercing him, or the Messiah will put the enemy leader to death by piercing him. Either of those are grammatically possible. The first option is the one that was argued by Eisenman and Wise in this publication. But actually most scholars opt for the second of these on the basis that the larger context of the Dead Sea Scrolls views the community leader of the Dead Sea community as the victorious son of David. So there's some ambiguity about that. You may hear about this particular scroll. Just understand that this is a scroll that is debated by scholars and its meaning is still unclear. The people's mourning is going to be so intense over the pierced one that it would be comparable to the grief that a family would feel over the death of a firstborn son. Or it would be expressed so loudly and volubly that the pagan ritual mourning of the fertility deities would be in mind. There was annually the weeping for Tammuz, which was part of the Canaanite ritual. And this is just simply an analogy that the mourning for the loss of the pierced one would be similar in volume to that pagan ritual. Each of the Israelite clans would mourn separately. But in the midst of that mourning, there would be a cleansing fountain that would be opened up for sin for the whole family of David and all Jerusalem. This fountain of cleansing would cleanse them from their sins. And so in this purification, all traces of idolatry would be removed, all prophecy would be removed, there would be a suppression of idols and a suppression of false prophets among the people. In fact, and this is a rather striking passage in chapter 13, parents would not even hesitate to obey the injunction in Deuteronomy to kill their own children if they were false prophets. Back in Deuteronomy 13, there is the law of prophethood, which says essentially that false prophets who are demonstrably leading people astray should be executed. And now in this particular passage, Zechariah says that people will be so conscientious about keeping the law that even if one of their own children turned out to be a false prophet, that child would be executed according to the law of Moses. In fact, people would be so hesitant about being a false prophet that they would dispense with all trappings that would indicate that they were a prophet. Apparently, some people tried to imitate Elijah the prophet with a garment of hair, and in doing this, they tried to say that they were prophets, but many of them were actually false prophets. Now, all of that's going to be discarded. They would get rid of anything that looked like they were a prophet. In fact, if they had any wounds on their body, which someone might suspect was the result of prophetic frenzy, they would deny that altogether and say, this is just a friendly scuffle between friends. This has nothing to do with me being a prophet. People will deny that altogether. Some have actually understood chapter 13 and verse 6 as though this were a messianic prediction of the beating of Jesus, but that probably is not correct. The context is very much against it. Rather, the context is that this would be the marks of prophetic ecstasy that people would deny that they were ever to be accused of being a prophet. And then there is what is sometimes called the Song of the Sword. These 3 verses in chapter 13, this poetic interjection. And it resumes the theme of the shepherd from the first oracle. The good shepherd is the one who stands as the representative of the Lord, stands by the Lord's side. But the sword of execution is called forth, and the good shepherd is going to be struck down, scattering the flock. So in this way, there are some links between this oracle and the previous oracle. Most of the flock will perish, though a third of the flock would survive by passing through purification and refinement. Most of the flock, in fact, is going to die. But the remnant that survives is going to become the covenant people of God. So these, once again, are the covenant words. They will be my people, I will be their God. This is the basic covenant formula for blessing. So with that in mind, we are getting ready to talk about the last part of this vision in Zechariah. As we come to the last chapter in the book of Zechariah, I need to talk just a moment about the language of the prophets regarding what is called the day of the Lord. The language, the day of the Lord, first begins in the book of Amos, actually, where Amos talks about the coming of the day of the Lord as a day of blackness, a day of doom, a day of darkness. Essentially, the term day of the Lord more or less corresponds to what we probably would call doomsday. Sometimes in the prophets it's called in the last days, sometimes it's called or in the days to come, and sometimes it's just called in that day. But all of these refer to the time when God will establish His sovereignty in the world, the day of Yahweh. So these expressions are a little bit fluid. They have a semantic range that not only look to something in the near future, but in some cases do double duty, not only to talk about the near future, but also to talk about the far future. Here's kind of a summary of some of these ideas that we find in the prophets. As the prophets use the term the day of the Lord or the last day, sometimes they're talking about what's going to happen in the exile of Israel and Judah to Assyria and Babylon. So this is in the near future. Sometimes they're talking about the judgment of God on surrounding nations who are near Israel and Judah, who will also come under the judgment of the invasions of Assyria and Babylon. Sometimes, however, this term day of the Lord seems to stretch ahead to the indeterminate future. The judgment of God on the whole world, which blasphemes Him. The disintegration of the universe. And in fact, some of the language we talked about in apocalyptic literature is also found in the prophets, such as the moon turning to blood and the sun being darkened and the stars falling. In this time, the day of the Lord, the people of God are going to be saved, while the rebels against God will come under judgment. And God's armies will be victorious over all opposition, and in the end there will be universal peace, so that the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. Language that you find both in the book of Isaiah and also in the book of Habakkuk. So the term day of the Lord is this broad vision of things that God's going to do in the future. And we run into this language in the last chapter of the book of Zechariah. The battle for the city of Jerusalem is going to be described as the day of the Lord. And in that day, all of the nations are going to surround Jerusalem and put it to siege. And accompanying that are the descriptions of all of the kind of atrocities that are typical of war. But God will intervene and He will save the city. And He will appear on the Mount of Olives with the armies of heaven, who are called the Holy Ones, the armies of the angels. And in the midst of a great earthquake, the mountain will split, and suddenly there will be an opening all the way from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the Dead Sea, which is right across the spine of mountains in the central hilllands of Judah. And so the Dead Sea, which now, at least, and for all of its history that we know about, has been a sea without any kind of outlet, which is why it's called the Dead Sea, suddenly it will be opened up to the waters of the Mediterranean River. Jerusalem will become secure forever, and all of her enemies will be destroyed. And everything is going to be affected. The terrain will be affected. The mountainous areas will become flat like a plain. The seasons will change. There will be light in evening time, not just in the daytime. And ultimately, the Lord will be king over the whole earth, over the whole world. Now, survivors from the nations that have attacked Jerusalem are now going to be forced or compelled to come to Jerusalem to worship the Lord and to celebrate the Festival of the Booths. So the nations are now going to turn to the Lord, and they are going to come and to worship Him in the great festivals. And every item in the whole city of Jerusalem will now become holy. Formerly, there was a distinction between what was holy and what was profane, and only those things associated with the temple and with Yahweh Himself would be holy. But now, everything is going to be holy. Everything is going to be associated with Yahweh. Everything from the bells on the horses to cooking pots. Everything is going to be holy because the Lord is now in the midst of the city. All dishonest merchants are going to be expelled from the city. The word that is used here is the word Canaanites. But Canaanite is really not here so much an ethnic term as it is a term for a racketeer or someone who is a dishonest merchant. They will all be banned from the temple. And then there is what is called the Song of the Sword. Now, we talked about the Song of the Sword. There's these 3 verses a little earlier in this oracle. And I want to, once again, as I did for the first oracle, talk about how the Song of the Sword is to be interpreted. One is a historical approach in which the Song of the Sword is interpreted in the history of the Old Testament. In this case, the attack upon the shepherd is the downfall of the dynasty of David. It goes back to the idea that David is the ideal shepherd of Israel, but when he dies, after his son Solomon, then the dynasty begins to fall apart and the flock is scattered, and eventually they are scattered in the exile when they are taken to Assyria and to Babylon. So in this approach to the vision and the Song of the Sword, the effort is made to try to link the ideas in this oracle with the history of Israel that ultimately ended in exile. A futuristic approach attempts to interpret all of these visions in the context of the New Testament. And here the shepherd is not David in the ancient world, but it is Christ in His coming to Jerusalem in His earthly ministry. And the scattering would be the flight of the disciples as they are scattered on the night that He is arrested. So very different approaches to this, and a lot of discussion by commentators taking very different approaches to this passage. At least 2 New Testament passages are clearly quoted from the second oracle. And I think we should keep those in the forefront, since because they are directly cited in the New Testament, they can give us some kind of a link between this oracle and what would happen in the time of Jesus. One, obviously, is this passage of the pierced one that is described. John's gospel particularly links the pierced one to the soldier's action of puncturing Jesus' side with a spear at his crucifixion. And John is going to directly quote the passage from the book of Zechariah, that they will look upon the one that they have pierced. In the book of Revelation, however, there's also a reference, because it says that not only Israel is going to view the pierced Messiah and mourn, but all of the peoples of the whole world will look upon the one that was pierced and mourn. So in the book of Revelation, there is a futuristic anticipation that the day will come when the nations of the world will mourn over the piercing of Jesus on the cross. The shepherd who is struck down, which is described in chapter 13, in the New Testament, this is quoted by Jesus himself, and he quotes it with reference to himself. He is the good shepherd who will be struck down. That is described in both Matthew and Mark, and also in the Gospel of John. The striking down of the flock and the scattering of the flock could refer to the Jewish wars of the first and second Jewish revolts. If it's taken in a more Christian sense, I suppose it could refer to the persecutions in the apostolic era, or if a person takes a dispensational approach, something that happens at the very end of the age. That one is a little less clear. But at least the idea that Jesus refers to himself as the shepherd who was struck down, that is a very clear reference. So the implications of this second oracle are very much linked to apocalyptic style literature. They're very much linked to at least a couple of clear passages in the New Testament. Dispensational interpreters tend to see this oracle as pointing toward the very end of the age. So often they will read Zechariah 14 as a description of the second coming of Jesus. When the Lord stands with his feet upon the Mount of Olives, they connect that with the passage in Acts chapter 1, in which Jesus ascended into heaven from the Mount of Olives. And angels then told the disciples that the Jesus you saw go away will come just like he left. He will come back to the same place. And so futurist interpreters often see the passage in Zechariah 14 where the Lord stands with his feet upon the Mount of Olives as being a reference to what is described later in Acts chapter 1. Following the second coming of Jesus, dispensationalists, of course, believe there will be the millennial kingdom. And so the vision and the language about Jerusalem and about the holiness of the city and about the nations coming to worship at the Festival of Tabernacles, they would connect all of that to what they believe to be the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. All millennialists, going back to St. Augustine and through the Reformers, Luther and Calvin and the general Reformed and Lutheran traditions, they tend to read this oracle as pointing toward a spiritual fulfillment rather than a physical fulfillment in the earth. So the spiritual fulfillment is largely in terms of the mission of the church. The idea of the nations that are coming in, the Philistines that will be cleansed, the nations that come to keep the Festival of Tabernacles. These are all symbolisms of the reaching of the gospel into the non-Jewish sections of the world and inviting Gentiles to become part of the people of God. Still others actually kind of see a double meaning, that in one sense there is both a historical fulfillment in the life of Jesus, but there is also a spiritual fulfillment symbolizing the future of the people of God in the period of the church. So that one is sort of a double reference, which you find in a number of prophetic passages, where a prophetic passage has something historical in mind here, but then it sort of jumps over a span of time and looks at something that will happen later in history. The wars that are described are very much similar to the kind of things you find described in the book of Revelation, which talks about the battle of the great day of God Almighty. The reference to the fountain in Jerusalem, that is a blessing and a cleansing for sin for the family of David. That certainly seems to be messianic in some sense, because Jesus, who comes from the family of David, is the source of cleansing for sin. The establishment of God's kingdom over the whole world. That certainly resonates with ideas that you find throughout the New Testament, culminating in the book of Revelation, where the New Jerusalem descends to the earth and the light of the nations are brought into it. At the same time, There is no distinction in the book of Zechariah between what the New Testament calls the first coming of Christ or the second coming of Christ. In fact, this is true for any passage in the Old Testament. None of the Old Testament prophecies about the coming of the Messiah envision the Messiah coming twice. They only really talk about the Messiah coming once. And it is only when you get to the New Testament in the language of Jesus himself that you have this idea that the Messiah not only will come the first time, but he will come the second time. So if the vision concerns the Messiah, at least vision in chapter 14 of Zechariah, then the images of both the first and the second advents of Christ seem to be collapsed into each other or superimposed upon each other in Zechariah. That's not too unusual, however. That is a fairly typical type of thing that happens in prophecy, where one event and another event are collapsed together and described in the same language throughout. So these last visions in the book of Zechariah are some of the more controversial ones. You'll find interpreters going several different directions in trying to interpret these visions. If these visions were actually given to Zechariah in the 6th century BC, in other words, if the latter part of the book of Zechariah is not by some unknown prophet, but actually by Zechariah himself, then they seem to function as assurances to the remnant of the community that they need to be involved in the building of the Second Temple, because that building of the Second Temple is part of God's great future that stretches out before them, and they have a stake in that future. So in the end, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah are very closely linked with the rebuilding of the Second Temple. Of course, both of them are mentioned in the book of Ezra. They are the preachers who preach out of their concern for the rebuilding of the Second Temple, and they assure the people that if they will put their hands to the work and with a full heart, they will finish the work of the building of the Second Temple, that this is part of God's great purpose for the future that will include the blessing of the nations and the bringing of peoples as alien as the Philistines into the remnant of Israel.